Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you as well to the Winifred and DeVillo Sloan Family Fund for supporting this event. The impact of the Erie Canal has been immense, socially, economically, and politically. And today we're going to look at several other canals here in New York State that were built in order to connect to the Erie Canal system, the Chenango, Chemung, and Genesee Valley Canals. But before we get to that, I just wanted to let you know about a few upcoming events here at the Erie Canal Museum. First, new thing for my commercials. I've added images. First, on October 5th at 1 p.m., we will be hosting one of our 2024 Artists in Residence, Alon Kopel, who will discuss the progress on his work doing rephotography of the canal, which is essentially doing then versus now looks at these historic landscapes, like here in Canastota, as you see on the screen. Our next lunchtime lecture will be on October 24th, and will feature Larry Bell from the Howland Stone Store Museum. He will be discussing Slocum Howland, a Quaker merchant who utilized the Erie Canal in his business endeavors, who is also a prominent abolitionist in the Finger Lakes region. Both lunchtime lectures and deeper dives occur monthly and are offered both virtually and in person. If you ever register for a lunchtime lecture, you will also receive a recording of one of our talks. This month, we are going to begin the process of renewing our annual passes, which gets you access to all of these talks throughout the year and the recordings. Next year, 2025, we'll be combining the two passes, lunchtime lectures and deeper dives, into a single lecture annual pass. If you sign up for either of those annual passes over the next 3-ish months, you will be registered for both in 2025. Additionally, a new feature we're adding to our lock tender membership level is complimentary registration to the annual passes. So consider signing up for that membership level or higher if you're interested, and never miss an Erie Canal Museum lecture again. Additionally, on the weekend of October 18th through 19th, we will be hosting a series of spooky Halloween-themed events. First, on October 18th, starting at 6:30, we will have our Erie, that's Erie with two E's, evening tours. A behind-the-scenes look at the Waylock building and some of the spookier stories from its history, as well as the canal in general. Then on October 19th, from 1 to 4 p.m., will be our Erie Canal Spooktacular, a fun family event featuring arts and crafts, trick-or-treating, and a lot of fun, supported by the Jim and Julie Boeheim Foundation. Finally, if you're here at the museum, you may have noticed on the back table, one, we've got some Chenango Canal books, also handouts for our newly launched bicentennial research project. With the bicentennial of the canal's completion coming up next year, we are putting out a call to anyone interested to submit scholarly articles on the history of the Erie Canal, or lateral canals are also perfectly acceptable. You can find out more at eriecanalmuseum.org/research. Anyway, enough of me talking. On to today's event. I'm happy to be joined today by Diane Van Slyke from the Chenango Canal Association, Jessica Moquin, Executive Director of the Chenango Canal Historical Society, and Gary Emerson, who will be discussing the Chemung Canal. He, since 2017, has served as the Schuyler County historian. Sorry, Gary, since no one else got the long intro.
No problem.
And I will also be talking about the Genesee Valley Canal. So a little on the format of what we're going to be doing here. We'll each have about 10 minutes to discuss our respective canals. And please, if you're on Zoom, put any questions you have in the chat. Then we'll talk a little amongst ourselves up here at the front table. And finally, we'll open the floor to questions if you have any. We are going to be going east to west, canal-wise. So we're going to start out with the Chenango Canal first. So give it up for Diane and.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm with the Chenango Canal Association, and little did I know what I was going to get into. I got involved to plant wildflowers. I ended up for the last 24 years being the president of the Chenango Canal Association, and that means chief cook and bottle washer. You do everything, and it's all volunteer. So anyway, the history is what holds me to this. And back in 1834, I mean, the people wanted a canal going north and south to connect Binghamton to the Erie Canal, because the Erie Canal in 1825 was opened up and showed so much success. And it developed towns, it developed businesses, and these people were farmers and small business people. I mean, when you opened up a little hamlet or a village, you didn't have a place to go work at. You know, you had your own place, you had your own work to do, and all they could do is raise crops to just fulfill what they needed right there in their little town because of the transportation. Route 20 was a transport, and it had mud holes in 3 seasons out of the year, and it was closed down the 4th. And it would take 9 days and 2 broken axles to get a horse and wagon from Sherburne all the way to Albany. So the canal was really needed. So people, they contacted the legislator and they lobbied year after year after year for over 8 years to get this open. Some of this information I actually got from Wade Lallier's book, who's here in the audience. He wrote about the Chenango Canal called Clinton Stitch. And honestly, it was very, very, very eye-opening. So when I got into the history, I found that people were remonstrating for a canal. And when they got it, there was joyous celebrations. So every year from 1826 to 1832, a bill was introduced to the New York State legislature, and each year it was defeated. Finally, the bill passed on February 23rd in 1833, and this article was published in the Anti-Masonic Telegraph in Norwich on Wednesday, February 27th, 1833.
All right, so here's that article, and again, I'm Jessica with the Chenango County Historical Society and Museum, which is located in Norwich. Canal celebration. Our village on Saturday afternoon last presented a lively scene of activity and bustle. As evening approached, the people from the surrounding country came flocking in, every countenance sparkling with pleasure. At about 4 o'clock, the stage arrived bearing a star-spangled banner on which was painted the words Chenango Canal. Soon after, the discharge of cannon announced the final passage of the bill, and a hearty shout from the multitudes assembled expressed the feelings with which the information was received. In the evening, the courthouse, jail clerk's office, bank, all the public houses, mechanic shops, and many private residences were brilliantly illuminated. Bonfires were also lighted up at each end of the town, and the old war dog stationed on the public square kept up a continuous roar, which made the village tremble and carried the joyful tidings in the surrounding country. Without concert, there appears a sort of a rivalry between the north and south parts of the village to render the celebration worthy of the occasion. Over the balustrades of the post office buildings at the south, there were suspended a row of glass lamps, which showed to great advantage, while on the front of General DeForest's Eagle Tavern at the north, there appears, as if by enchantment, a beautiful transparency representing the Chenango Canal, which words were painted in large capitals over the picture, with a packet boat drawn to the life, moving over the waters, on the side of which were inscribed the words Norwich Packet. The last was represented as being drawn by 3 horses under the guidance of a rider mounted upon the first. And from the windows of the boat, the smiling countenances of the passengers appeared, as if catching a glimpse of our beautiful village as they passed along, while a lady and gentleman were promenading the deck, apparently viewing the more distant scenery which fills the background. In the forepart of the packet, a person appeared as if giving directions to the driver, while aft the helmsman guided its course. On each end of the transparency was painted the word canal. Thus far, all was well enough and in entire accordance with our own and the public sentiment. But we beg leave to enter our decided protest against the attempts which were made by some misguided political zealots of the Jackson men in the village to give the celebration a party coloring and assume all the merit and rejoicing to themselves. The subscription paper to raise funds had their party watchword at the head. The General Committee of 10 was exclusively Jackson, and pains seemed to be taken to drive off every anti-Mason from the general festivity. A pole was raised on the green, crowned with hickory sprigs, and a large Jackson flag raised to the top, while at about half the distance up, labeled in much smaller letters, Chenango Canal, thus plainly intimidating that the canal itself was a matter of secondary consideration to the idolatry of their chieftain. In addition to this, several loads of some 20-odd choice spirits rode out 2 miles to meet and escort Senator Hubbard into the village, ascribing to him by their language and conduct superhuman power and influence in the passage of the bill. Their object of appropriating to themselves exclusive praise and applause was signally unsuccessful. Our friends were in no whit behind him in their manifesting of joy, and we shall not be contradicted when we say that for taste, beauty, and brilliancy of illumination, they went ahead of their opponents, and we hope it may prove a lesson to certain men how they again undertake to set up their own selfish views against the sound sense of the public and to convert the current of the general joy and good feeling into party finesse and squabbling. About 9 o'clock, a large party sat down to an excellent supper prepared by General DeForest, after which some dozens of champagne were drank, and in due time the company separated, highly satisfied with the celebration and with their good cheer. Note, since the above was in type, we have learned, and we regret the circumstance, that Mr. Hubbard, on consequence of the fatigue of traveling, not having perfectly recovered from his recent indisposition, was unable to enjoy the good things prepared by his friends for his reception, and that he was obliged to retire to his residence almost immediately after his arrival. This is from the Courier, Binghamton, Thursday, February 28th, 1833. And I encourage all of you to come visit Norwich. Many of these landmarks are still there, and we have the opportunity to experience them firsthand.
Okay, I think we're gonna move ahead to the next book. When they developed the canal, one of the style boats was the packet boat. And this is a carving of one that somebody had built back in 1850s, and they gave it to us. And the people would be inside for eating, and then they would be on top of the boat to enjoy all the rural scenery. And a lot of times when you've probably heard the Erie Canal song, low bridge, everybody down. Well, that was because the top of the boat was only 2 feet below the bottom of the bridge that you went under to get into the town. And when they heard that horn, low bridge, everybody down, they had to get down a ladder and get off of that top, or else they'd be swept into the water. So one of the packet boat leaders, they had 2 boats, the Lily, one was the Norwich, and we have a poster, a copy of a poster of it, and Jessica's going to read.
So this is dated 1865, daily packet line, the fare, $1.50, Norwich and Binghamton. So the packet boat, the Lily, captained by William Stever, leaves Norwich Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 6 a.m., Oxford 8 a.m., East Green 10:30 a.m., Green at noon, Chenango Forks 2 p.m., and Port Crane at 4 p.m., arriving at Binghamton at 6 p.m. The packet Norwich alternating with the Lily on the same timetable, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. Again, that's the Norwich packet by Captain Henry T. Stever, and reverse all that I just said on the Lily. Packages and freight. All packages designed for this line of boats should be marked via packet or care of the respective captains. All articles so marked and entrusted to their care will receive the strictest attention. Travelers favoring this line with their patronage will, when desired, be served with meals at regular hours and polite attention given to their comfort. These boats having been fitted up in the most approved modern style for passengers. And this is Norwich, September 16th, 1865, printed in the by J.L. Burtis Job Printer, Democrat Office out of Oxford, New York. And we do have a model of the packet boat, the Lily, at the Chenango County Historical Society. She's 2/3 the size of what the Lily would have been. And the Chenango Canal Association is going to be doing a program called Life on the Lily during our Path Through History weekend coming up. So you can also get a chance to experience her firsthand too, if you'd like.
Now, this is a map that was hand drawn, and it was to show the growth of the little hamlet of Bouteville. All those little blocks, if you can see it, actually, yeah, I'll leave this out and you can see this afterwards. All of these blocks were growth of different houses and businesses. It never came to pass. Even though there were 60 stagecoaches going through Bouteville on Route 20, which was Cherry Valley Turnpike, when the canal came through, they thought it was going to really boom like Utica and Chenango and Canastota and all the Syracuse and all these, like the Erie Canal. It just never took. But because of that 15 miles on the Chenango Canal, that's when the mules or the horses had to rest. They could go about that far. So they would stop and they would need to, do horseshoes. They would need to get supplies and eat and get all kinds of things done. So a little town would crop up. So that's what grew the southern tier. This was found right on the Chenango Canal towpath trail. So it came from a towing horse. So it was dug up about 2 feet down underneath the ground. Another thing was the building of the canal was unusual. It was called the best built canal of New York State. Sorry. But it was because they used 7 reservoirs. Am I?
You're at 10.
Okay, I'm at 10. So the 7 reservoirs just supplied all the water, and that's why it took 8 years to convince the legislators that this would work. They used rain gauges to do it. So this is just a wonderful, wonderful canal, and we hope you can come down. I'll give you a tour. We're right in Bouteville.
All right, thank you. Now we'll move on to Gary with the Chemung Canal.
Okay. We got a
Oh,
put
yes,
up there.
right.
There we go. All right, this photograph shows the Chemung Canal, and it lists the years it was open from 1833 to 1878. This shows it going through the village of, it was called Havana then. Today it's called Montour Falls in New York. But it shows the canal coming through and some boats there, and running right along next side of it is what put the canal out of business eventually, railroads running right next door to it. But the next slide shows the location of the Chemung Canal. And so we see it ran from Elmira, New York, with the Chemung River all the way to north to Seneca Lake. And it had a feeder canal that brought water from the Chemung River near Corning over to Horseheads, New York. And that supplied most of the water for the canal. And then from there, the boats were towed up Seneca Lake to the Geneva and Seneca Canal in Geneva, and that got you into the Erie Canal. So the Chemung Canal was located close to the Pennsylvania coal region. That was a big impetus for getting the canal built. But in 1825, once the Erie Canal opened, everybody wanted a canal all across New York State. So as you mentioned, everybody kept petitioning in local communities to the state legislature to get a canal built. And the Chemung Canal began applying in 1825 to get built, but it's not until 1829 it finally passes both houses of the legislature and gets approved. And there was a huge celebration in Elmira. In fact, you mentioned how people were so glad that the Chenango Canal got passed. They were very happy in Elmira. One newspaper account I read said everybody in Elmira was drunk. I'm sure that's hyperbole, but people were just so happy that this canal was going to happen. It promised to bring so much to them and improve their lives. It also would be rather inexpensive to build. It only cost about $325,000 to build the Chemung Canal, compared to, I think, the Chenango Canal was called the $1 Million Canal, was it not?
Yeah.
Yes, so it was a lot cheaper and much cheaper than the Genesee Valley Canal. And that was one thing that helped get the legislature to approve passing it. But the area really needed better transportation. All the roads were horrible. They were just a sea of mud in the spring. Your wagons often sank right down to the axle and you couldn't move. So people desperately needed transportation. They could connect to the outside world and be able to market their goods and bring goods in that they needed. So they had relied on rivers to transport goods, but that's only possible a short time out of the year. In the springtime, the water was higher. So they used to use arcs to float goods and lumber down the Chemung River to the Susquehanna River and down to Baltimore. But the Chemung Canal would bring a more long-term artificial river, so to speak, that would allow them to get goods from other places and connect with other communities and send their goods out. And like I mentioned, the steamboats could tow the boats north on the Seneca Lake, and sometimes storms came up on the lake. And on the bottom of Seneca Lake are actually a few hundred sunken canal boats on the lake that are being explored now. Art Cohn from the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum has been coming down and exploring where all the different canal boats are sunk in the lake and taking photographs of them. It's very interesting work that he's done. I wish I had his job. We can have the next slide here, maybe. Here's a map that shows the Chemung Canal running from Elmira to Seneca Lake, and it shows the feeder canal coming over from Gibson near Corning, New York. They built a dam on the Corning on the Chemung River near Corning, and that supplied most of the water for the Chemung Canal, and the feeder canal brought that water over. Now you see a lot of numbers on this map between Pine Valley and Montour Falls. Those are locks. There were 53 locks total in the Chemung Canal. 44 of them were from Havana or Montour Falls to Pine Valley. So it's pretty slow going on this canal. This was not really a passenger canal. You didn't see many packet boats on the Chemung Canal. It's mostly a freight canal because it was just so slow going. People often ask me, how long did it take to go from a canal boat from Elmira to Watkins Glen? 2.5 to 3 days. You could walk it faster. And many people did, or they took a stagecoach, or they rode a horse. So it really wasn't much of a packet route canal. And let's talk about how it changed the area a little bit. Well, let's see, I think I have another slide here first. This shows the profile of the canal, and you can see all those locks from Havana or Montour Falls to Pine Valley. The ground rises 450 feet. So that's that steep climb that they had to have all those locks for. You often had locks right on top of each other. You left one lock and go a few feet and you're into another lock to make that climb up there. But the canal really changed the economy of the area. Before the canal was built, everything was barter. You would want to buy something, somebody, you give them a barrel of flour or something, or a barrel of sugar. You really didn't have any cash. But with the canal opening, you started to get banking. The Chemung Canal Bank was formed in Elmira solely for the purpose of helping to finance the canal. And the Chemung Canal Bank is still in existence to this day. But cash becomes the thing now after that. It also changed the demographics. Before the canal was built, the area around Elmira and to Watkins Glen was mostly New England Yankees. But now you have this huge influx of Irish who come in. And it really, you really have a whole canal culture that develops of these working men who are largely Irish, and they're known for drinking a lot and fighting a lot and those kind of things. And in fact, young men used to come to Millport, which is one of the main hubs on the canal, and just to challenge the canal workers in a fight. Most of them went home regretting their decision, but they just had this whole canal culture of these working class people come in. You also could buy goods that you couldn't get previously. Now you can get goods thanks to New York City being really a gateway city that offered the world to them, because you have goods from Europe coming there, goods from the Caribbean came in there, and then they could go through the canal and reach Elmira and other towns along the Chemung Canal. So you had goods from the Caribbean. You had things like oysters coming into the area, lemons and limes. Goods from Europe would arrive in the area. There were also local businesses that were developed because of the Chemung Canal. Pottery works were developed along the canal. Building pottery was shipped out. There was boat building. People built canal boats all along the canal. There were many, many boat yards and towns along the Chemung Canal. You had groceries right next to the canal line. So boatmen could get off and buy groceries. They could also buy alcohol in those groceries. Quite often the men working on the canal were drunk, and so were the guys running the grocery store. You had flour mills. You had sawmills. There was a business in Elmira formed called the rolling mills that made strap iron. It went on the first railroad tracks. The first railroads had wooden rails with a strap iron on top of it, and they manufactured that in Elmira. The canal also changed the environment because people looked around and said, well, look at all these hardwoods here. We have oak and maple. We can cut these down and ship the logs on the canal and make money from it. If you look at photographs or drawings from that time period of the area. You'll see the hillsides are just totally bare. They just clear cut everything. There's nothing there. So that meant it was drier in the summertime, which meant it was harder to get enough water to keep the canal going. It's also led to more flooding because they don't have the trees to help hold the moisture in the ground. So that was a problem. There were certain drawbacks to the canal. One is the fact that there were so many locks, like we showed there. You also had, oh yes, let's go to the next picture, previous one. I mentioned about businesses, the canal. This is a flour mill that was in Montour Falls. That's now located where the canal used to be on what's called Canal Street today. But one of the problems with the lock, is the next slide here, is that they built wooden locks to make the canal cheap, so it would get passed by the legislature. So the locks were all made of wood. This is the guard lock at Gibson near Corning, New York, that supplied most of the water for the canal near the dam. You can see that lock's in kind of rough shape. The canal opened in 1833, but by 1840, all the locks were rotting, falling apart. They had to go in and look about replacing them all. The canal was never really enlarged. The locks were 15 feet wide and 90 feet long. They never got any bigger than that. So boats from the Erie Canal that went through these much larger locks could not go through the Chemung Canal. You would have to take everything off that boat and put it into a smaller boat to take it into the Chemung Canal. But of course, one problem is the canals are closed in the wintertime. And they're not operating, so railroads could compete against them. And then there also was the cost of upkeep. Okay, thanks. This is the toll collector's office in Horseheads, New York. In the life of the canal, they collected about $500,000 in tolls, but to keep the canal up cost $3.5 million. So it's basically a money pit they're pouring it into. And the canal gets replaced because the railroads are just faster and more ran year round. It could just do the things the canal just couldn't do all the time. So it left its mark on our landscape, a lot of place names. There's a town called Millport. It was once a port in the canal. You got canal streets in many towns. The Chemung Canal Bank's still around. And there's still part of the Chemung Canal that still functions as a line of water from Seneca Lake to Montour Falls. It leads to a marina there. So the railroads really spelled the end of the canal. But that's all I have. Been cut off.
What year did the Chemung close?
1878, same year as many other lateral canals closed, yeah.
Okay, great. And there we can see the tolls collected.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, there's
Versus 3.5?
yeah, 3.5 million to keep it running and $500,000 collected in tolls.
Pay that.
Taxpayers.
Yes.
These were publicly owned canals, so the
Yeah.
taxpayers are paying. That's one reason why the lateral canals got shut down.
If you're upset by that loss of money, here comes
Here comes the big one.
my big one. So I'll be talking about our third lateral canal of the day, the Genesee Valley Canal. So a little on, oops, I should start my timer too. So the Genesee Valley is formed during the last ice age. It goes almost all the way to the southern end of New York. Actually, I think it does technically start in Pennsylvania, but it is separated by a glacial moraine from the Allegheny watershed, which drains into the Ohio River and then the Mississippi River. So you're separated by only a few miles of water or of land. The Genesee River from the entire gigantic Mississippi River watershed, which is important for our story. A little more about Genesee. The word means beautiful valley in the language of the Seneca people. And it is indeed a gorgeous valley. And the valley has been the home of the Seneca people from time immemorial. This big, wide, beautiful valley is also very fertile, which will become very important later in our story as well. They also have these on them, pictured here, the high falls of the Genesee River. There are a lot of waterfalls on the Genesee, as we will talk about. But these waterfalls become transformed in the 1820s when the Erie Canal opens up right just about a quarter mile to the south of these falls. And the small village of Rochesterville is going to become kind of the quintessential Erie Canal boomtown, becoming the flour city, FLOUR. In 1834 alone, 500,000 barrels of wheat will be ground into flour using the water power of these falls and the transportation offered by the canal. And like I said, the Genesee Valley is this very fertile valley. However, as soon as the canal opens up, people recognize that there are some issues getting into the Genesee Valley. For instance, the 20-mile journey from Scottsville to Rochester by land takes 12 to 14 hours by itself. And, you know, a wagon's carrying 1 to 2 tons of wheat, maybe. So kind of settlement of the Genesee and growing all this wheat that these mills of Rochester need is being impeded by poor transportation in the rest of the valley. You know, there's some attempts to build a steamboat on the river that is met with mixed success, etc. Almost as soon as the canal opens, though, you've got people looking at, because the canal, as everyone's talked about, after the Erie Canal is so successful, everywhere else in New York wants its own canal to get hooked up. And that happens with the Genesee Valley as well. In fact, in 1827, James Geddes, one of the original engineers on the Erie, he actually does an informal survey of the Genesee Valley, says like, yeah, this seems possible that we could do it, though it's kind of a crazy canal, he thinks. However, the people of the Genesee Valley and a lot of merchants in New York City as well really lobby the state hard for the construction of a canal through the Genesee Valley. And ultimately, in 1834, the state will authorize the construction of a Genesee Valley Canal. Frederick Mills is hired as the surveyor. Well, that's when they authorized the survey. 1836 is when the canal is authorized to go to Olean on the Allegheny River. And so this is going to have the dual purpose of bringing that wheat from the fertile Genesee Valley to the mills of Rochester here, and also connecting the Erie Canal system to the giant Mississippi River system as well. Elisha Johnson is hired as the chief engineer, and they start digging in 1837. And the canal they plan is an ambitious one. Here we see a map going from Rochester all the way 124.75 miles to Olean. This canal is going to raise 978 feet above the level of Rochester, which is its lowest point, hitting its height, a summit level of 1,488 feet. This would be the highest summit level, so the highest level of a canal in the world at this time. The plan calls for 112 locks across the 124 miles. For reference, the 363-mile-long Erie has 83 locks on it. So this works out to 1.1 lock per mile. And we talked about the Chenango Canal. It's called derisively the $1 million canal. This is projected to cost $2 million to construct, which the state would have been happy if it had ended up actually costing $2 million. But they start digging 1837. They actually make a lot of progress in the first few years. They actually reach Mount Morris in a mere 3 years. In 1840, they hit Mount Morris. Those of you who know the Genesee Valley well know that Mount Morris is when you would start to encounter some real challenges in the Genesee Valley as well. That's right before you get to Letchworth State Park today. Additionally, by the next year, they have 52 miles of this canal completed, all the way to Shakers in 1841. They also built a side cut to Dansville in 1842. Which itself is an interesting story. If you go to Dansville, there's a road called Battle Street. That is because this was just supposed to be a feeder, right, for the Genesee Valley Canal. So the state was like, we're going to hook it up to the water source here. sorry, residents of Dansville, it's not going to go all the way into downtown Dansville. The people of Dansville really wanted this canal in town, so they built their own kind of extension of the canal. When the state contracted crews reached near those local crews, the state was like, "You can't do this." But the people of Dansville said, "Yes, we can," and fought the New York State contractors in the kind of Battle of Dansville, if you will, as the residents of Dansville wanted a connection to this canal. However, 1842 is where some of the big trouble begins for the Genesee Valley Canal, indeed all of the New York State canal system and all of America's canal systems as well. You see in 1837, there was kind of a global financial recession, the Panic of 1837. Banks start calling in loans. A lot of different states had invested, including New York, in building new canals. And a lot of states, including New York, almost went bankrupt over this because they had overextended themselves on canals. So Governor William Seward signs what is called the Stop and Tax Law, which says we will stop building canals until we raise enough tax money to start to be able to pay for these canals again. So construction of the Genesee halts right before they hit this really challenging section of the Genesee Valley, which is the Genesee Valley Gorge pictured here. They will finally raise enough money in 1847 to continue work on the canal, though the engineers are instructed to kind of cut costs where they could. What Gary identified with those wooden locks, they move over to those on this section of the Genesee Valley, kind of try to save money on building the canal. And they're going to spend years first trying to tunnel through the Genesee Valley Gorge. Eventually, they arrive at what you see here, the canal snaking around the edge of the gorge. So if you ever go to Letchworth State Park, this is the opposite side of the road that you drive on. It must have been horrifying to be leading a mule on just the lip of this canyon. There is an area kind of once you got out of the gorge, it was called Jockey's Alley at the time. This is kind of like the center of Genesee Valley debauchery. As the name implies, there are a lot of horse races there. There's also bars, prostitution, etc. That area would eventually get taken over. A religious college, upset by the kind of historic vice nature of this area, takes over and founds a Christian college there, now Houghton College, to kind of try to cleanse the area of its sins. If you will. But anyway, that's an interesting connection to the canal. They're going to keep going. They cross the Genesee at Portageville with an aqueduct. Then they hit that summit level, which is another really challenging section, namely because where are you going to get water from? Right? You're almost 1,500 feet above sea level. And you're well above the Genesee River. As you can see here, they're bridging that gap between the Allegheny and Genesee River. And ultimately, the decision is to build two reservoirs, one at Ishua Creek. My apologies to anyone from the Genesee Valley. I butcher every
Issue.
What was it? Ishua Creek, and the other at Oil Creek. They run into some issues at Oil Creek as parts of the area around Oil Creek had been reserved in the Treaty of Big Tree as a Seneca Nation reservation. This goes to court and is litigated in the 1850s and 60s. Ultimately, the state finds in favor of the Seneca, though they then ignore the courts and flood several acres of the Seneca Reservation anyway, in the creation of what is today Cuba Lake, which fed the Genesee Valley Canal. And finally, in 1861, they reach Olean. Only took them, what was it, 25 years or so. it's going to cost $6.7 million to construct versus that $2 million price tag, and cost an additional $2.8 million in upkeep. That is against $860,000 collected in tolls. So kind of a bit of a failure. It, like the Chemung and Chenango, is built for that original 40-foot wide Erie Canal. So by the time it opens, it's already pretty much out of date, and has to use smaller boats. Like many of these other canals, it closes 1878. Then its rights were bought by the Genesee Valley Canal Railroad for the whopping price of $11,400. So the state took a bit of a loss on this one, though that railroad actually operated at least in part until 1971. And the canal, while a kind of financial and technical failure for New York State, the towns that it connected did benefit greatly. Over 400,000 bushels of wheat were sent down the canal in just a 10-year period of time from 1845 to 1855. That's about 1/3 of all the grain that ended up being milled in Rochester. Also, 200 million board feet of lumber were transported down the canal, along with gypsum, dairy, crude oil. With its peak year, 159,000 tons of goods traveled down the canal. And in the decade after kind of that main lower section is built, the population of the Genesee Valley would triple, and land as would land under cultivation. So, the Genesee, I think it's fair to say it was a failure, but the folks living in Mount Morris would probably disagree with me. So that's the Genesee Valley. I also wanted to end us on this map from the late 1850s. All three of our canals are, I believe, on this. And you can see the web of canals that kind of fed into the Erie system by this point in about 1860. That yellow line is everywhere in the country whose primary port was New York City, all connected via canal. So I find this a pretty powerful map. That's also them projecting, the red line is their projection for the enlargement of the canal. So that didn't fully work out, but they didn't anticipate railroads as much. All right, so that's all three of our canals. Well, I'll open it up to the table. Anyone have anything they want to ask each other?
Gary, everything you said applies to the Chenango Canal too, and it was all state run.
Yep. And
it was all funded by taxpayers, all of us. But the good things that came out were things that they didn't project, like the farmer being able to sell to New York City, the growth of professional people that could come in to these towns, the buildings that went up, and they're still here today. And the reservoir system that was an experiment that fed the Chenango Canal, the reservoirs are still there today, and they're multi-million-dollar homes on them, some of them. Who would have thought? So boating and recreation is just as important to us as practical transportation was back in the 1800s. But you brought up so many good points, and so did you. They're all applicable to all three canals.
Yeah, there's many common threads between all these canals, and like mentioned already, meaning the canals financially were failures, but for the communities that they touched, they were a huge success. There was so much money being made and so many businesses started, and it really improved these people's lives tremendously by having this contact with the outside world. So you can't weigh the success of canal just in its own finances. It's also what it did to the community.
One thing I was thinking about as we were all talking, all of our canals essentially hook up to Pennsylvania. I know one of the big kind of stumbling blocks for the Genesee being successful was the upper Allegheny River. They kept anticipating like, oh, naturally Pennsylvania will want to hook up to the New York State canal system, and they were less enthusiastic about that. They never approved it. I don't know, how did you two's canals connect to Pennsylvania, if at all?
We never did.
Oh,
We went to Binghamton and shortly another amount of money was appropriated to have an extension because the coal was our biggest shipment. But what was happening was because we didn't connect to the coal yards, they had the train, which was already in function, bring the coal to a little area outside of Binghamton. They hand shoveled it into the canal boats. And then the canal boats brought it up, and coal was something like $2 a ton at that time, and it opened up all these homes to have coal to heat with instead of cutting down trees. And it was relied on. It was definitely relied on. And then when the trains took it, the price doubled and it went up to $4. But because the train companies bought up all the coal yards in Pennsylvania, we couldn't connect. So they shut it down and it never happened.
There's actually a little Facebook affinity group called the Chenango Canal and Binghamton Extension. So if you get a chance to check that out and you want to connect with other folks who have an affinity for canals, it's one of the most active Facebook canal groups out there at the moment.
And the Chemung Canal, I mean, that was one of the big reasons for building the canal, because it was close to those Pennsylvania coal yards. So they had railroads that brought coal up to Corning, New York, and from there it could get put on the Chemung Canal and then sent all through New York State. I mean, places like Rochester and Syracuse and New York City, they don't have firewood. They need this coal. So it was really very, very beneficial for them to have access to this coal. And at first, like I mentioned, the railroads and the canals worked together because there weren't that many railroads at first. So they kind of had to work in conjunction with each other. But I know there was one gentleman in Watkins Glen who had a coal business there. His name was John McGee, and he had a trestle works that brought rail cars right out to onto the lake, and they dumped the coal into the canal boats and then could ship it up the lake. But he hated the Chemung Canal. It's just too slow for him. It wasn't open year round. So he eventually built a rail line along the west side of Seneca Lake, and he just bypassed the canal completely with his coal shipments. And, you know, it was one thing that really spelled the death knell of Chemung Canal.
And just as an ironic twist, John Jervis, who was the chief engineer of the Chenango Canal, was also just prolific in designing and doing things. And he designed a railroad car with the front wheels being, I don't know how it works, but he did the smaller wheels that were able to make the railroad car turn on curves. And otherwise it would just be able to go straight. And that cinched it for the death of the canals because the railroads could grow. And he also had the Chenango Canal bring up the first engine for a railroad. It brought up the engine for it. So
Same with the Chemung Canal.
Yeah.
The first railroad
Yeah.
engines was brought by canal boat.
yeah, yeah.
I see in the Zoom chat, we've got some folks commenting on the Black River Canal. Yep, check them out. They did operate into the 1920s, mainly to feed water into the system. It's their big use. I think there are one lateral that really survives. Also, just for clarification, because someone was asking, the Chemung and Chenango canals are two different waterways, so they do have, I know, somewhat similar names.
They were Indian names.
Indian names, yeah.
Yeah, Native American, and they think that Chenango meant bull thistle. I don't know if anybody ever remembers the weed bull thistle. Used to grow all over the place. Big thistly, prickly leaves and a beautiful flower on top that was very fragile. And they called it Chenango.
And Chemung means big horn, because Native Americans found a very large mastodon horn in the river, and so they called it the Chemung River, the Big Horn River.
Oh.
Yes.
I have a question, Gary. So you had those 44 lots
Right.
in that short distance, and they average, it looks like they average about 10 feet. Was that a defining height because of the wood construction or you know, I mean, there's a lot of lots of.
Yeah, there were some that were deeper. Some were 12 feet, some were
Yeah.
actually 15
No, like
feet.
20, 30, 40 feet.
No, nothing like that. No.
Not
They wouldn't have had the water to maintain locks that large. Yeah.
That's another question. Refill, recharge them. And have them make closer.
Yeah.
We've got pictures of that up here, if anybody wants to come up
Each lock
later.
usually had like a cutout along the bed of the canal to create like a pond on both sides.
Yeah.
And that really helped supply the water to make the lock work. It was all by gravity.
Yeah.
I say that because I spent a little bit of time in Canada and slips, the lock is so long, you know, it's 60, 80 feet or something.
Yeah.
But of course you can't river
Yeah.
charge.
All right, there's a abandoned railroad bed that's now a hiking, biking trail that runs right next to much of the Chemung Canal between Montreux Falls and Millport. It's called the Catherine Valley Trail, and you can still see some of the remains of the old locks, in the Chemung Canal along that trail.
And the same for the Chenango Canal as well. The Canal Association has done quite a lot in partnership with the Hamilton-based Partnership for Community Development to develop recreational along those towpath trails and to be able to see the remnants of the locks. It's our crew at the museum went to visit this summer, and it's kind of neat to stand in the middle of where the locks and the sides of the walls are and just picture it. You know, they weren't big by modern standards, but for a person living at that time, those ships and those locks had to be pretty impressive.
Likewise, the Genesee Valley Canal also has its new recreational assets. The Genesee River Greenway, which is began in the 1990s. That Genesee Valley Canal right of way was purchased by a power company, and then New York has been working on buying up different parts of that and restoring it. I know that by Nunde, there are a lot of examples of old historic locks. There's also some closer to Rochester as well. So from what I understand, the Genesee River has been eating up historic sections of the canal because it meanders a lot.
I have a question for both of you. Did you find that when the canal was defunct, that the railroads used the same channel to grow? Did they follow the canal?
There was talk about building a railroad line on the canal towpath. It
Mhm.
never really came to fruition, but what they did do is they eventually built an electric trolley line from
No.
Elmira to Watkins Glen, and that used some of the old Chemung Canal towpath. It's an old, trolley tracks, right? Excuse me, right on the towpath of the canal.
Yeah, and meanwhile, the Genesee Valley, the whole right of way of the canal got bought by probably my least favorite railroad name ever, the Genesee Valley Canal Railroad, which used the right of way. From what I understand, it was mostly the towpath they used. They also kind of cannibalized a lot of the stonework and what have
Yeah.
you from
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about the Chenango? Did you guys end up?
Yeah, definitely. You can see, the utility poles were put up along the same line. The railroad is right next to it.
Route 12, pretty much.
Route 12B was built,
Mhm.
right? It followed the same, back in where there was only two engineering schools, and one was in Troy, that Rensselaer Polytechnic, they taught engineering, and so did West Point on the
Right.
Hudson, the only two in the country. And none of our guys went to that built the canal, but they studied it, and it was just amazing. The same path that was decided to go on has been looked at again and again, and over the years, they would have done the same darn thing. And so they had an advantage to put the railroad in and the utility poles in. Just amazing. You wonder what's next. We got all these roads and everything. I always wonder what's going to be next. Are we just going to be flying to Syracuse from Southville, Hamlet? Are we going to have and then the Erie, there's been talk, I was part of a committee that was studying that, and they were saying they would love to have little inlets coming off of the Erie for residents to have a car parked in the front and boat parked in the back, and then it would also be good in the western side for irrigation. For all the agriculture, the grapes and things that are growing around the Finger Lakes. Wouldn't that be wonderful to use the Erie water? Because the commercial trade and the industrial trade on the Erie is not keeping up as they wanted to. It's a lot more recreational now. And they gotta capitalize on it. They gotta change what's next. What's the next thing to do with these beautiful structures that were built and enjoyed over hundreds of years and, don't let them go to ruin. Some of these canals would have been turned into swamp.
Yeah.
With all the erosion and everything and the fall and everything falling in.
Well, after the canals closed, that was kind of a problem. The canals became a menace to the communities because they were just sitting there with stagnant water full of dead animals,
Yep.
sewage.
Yep.
They just smelled to high heaven. And so they began making efforts to have the state help pay money to fill them in. And so today we have a street in Montour Falls called Canal Street. It's canal filled in. It used to just be a stagnant
The
pool
Erie
of water
Canal,
that was
yeah.
poisoning people's wells.
Erie Boulevard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, right next to your Boulevard.
Yeah.
I just wanted to address, we got one comment in the chat, which was if the lateral canals were as successful as the Erie, would they have enlarged them? And probably, they did enlarge, three of the lateral canals, the actual successful ones financially, the Champlain, Oswego, and Cayuga Seneca. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
if these were money-making ventures,
Yeah.
sure.
But the problem with
they
the
weren't.
cost, I don't think they would have spent the money on it, especially when you got private businesses of railroads operating right next to them that
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is also true. Yeah.
Well,
they could do a better
a
job.
big attraction is fishermen and water trade, people in kayaks and canoes. If we could ever get ours cleared out enough for that, that would be a benefit financially to all the little connecting villages that it goes to.
Yeah.
So,
I think it's really neat also to take a wider view of how in our case, the Chenango Canal supported, Diane suggested like every 15 miles or so, there are these communities along Route 12 that are still vibrant today. They're small town USA or that Norman Rockwellian kind of, a lot of folks, think of Norwich and Oxford and Green and that sort of venue. And there are so many innovations that have come and gone along that route. And it's like there's like this spirit of innovation, scrappiness that's come through.
yeah.
Where Norwich was the home to the David Madole Hammer Factory. So those of you who've heard the phrase, don't go flying off the handle, that's because literally before David Madole came along, hammerheads were flying off of handles. And he created the Adzi hammer and didn't have the presence of mind to per se like patent it so that he could, make a killing off of it. But that Adzi hammer design is what we have today. But by the time he died in 1893, that was the best-selling hammer in the world. And it was because he had a great design and he was right on the Chenango Canal. So those hammers were going to New York City and to parts all over the world. So there was a piano factory, and then just further down in Green, there was the Lion Iron Works, which later became Raymond, home of the pallet truck. And
I think
Yeah.
it's just a bowl of Mott's apple
yeah,
cider.
Mott's applesauce,
gosh,
yes.
Right in
That's
Belleville.
Right in Belleville. So
Right on
these
the canal.
flavors exist, the innovation remains. So
Yep.
what's next? No, hammer flavored, cider flavored hammers. I don't know.
Corning, where
Yeah.
is Corning connected?
Corning glass actually originated in New York City. It was the Brooklyn Flint Works, and they decided to move the whole company to Corning, New York, and they did it by canal. So they loaded everything up, packed it on canal boats, went to the Erie Canal, and then came down to the Chemung Canal and brought it all to Corning, New York.
Nice.
Yeah.
Are there any questions out of the audience? Yes.
Well, make a comment. Take today's barge canal, or they call it Erie Canal. How much money is that making for the state? I would say,
Yes,
that was it.
Mhm.
It's probably better
you would be correct.
to rain it, take it over and take your crew away. But another comment is, 90% of the state population is along canal route.
Indeed.
So there's that. And we talking about canals and money makers. It's, that's when we were worried about making profits for the state. Now, we don't make any money off the thruway. We just maintain it. You have to change your mindset of how you look at it.
Yeah, I think we would all agree that the canals, like we've talked about, they were valuable in other ways besides just kind of basic profit loss. Canal system to this day probably is as well. If anyone from New York State government is watching, don't build a larger throughway out of it. I know we have at least one Canal Corporation employee here today as well.
No.
You probably want to keep it in your job as well. We have a lot of questions. I know there was one in the back too, yeah.
One more, Gary mentioned a little bit about the stagnant water, but Gary, can you tell us a little bit more about the impact on public health that the canals have?
Ooh,
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, the canal was seen as something that would benefit the communities and bring all these goods there, and they could ship goods out, but they didn't bother to think it also brings death to their doorstep, because all these canal workers traveling over state are bringing in smallpox and the flu and other diseases, because they're spreading it all over the state with it. And when they were building the Chemung Canal and some of the other canals as well, in the late 1820s, early 1830s, there was a cholera epidemic that was sweeping through the United States, and the cholera was popping up all along the route of the Erie Canal and even along the line of the Chemung Canal when they were building it. They had trouble sometimes keeping enough workers around because of the threat of disease. The communities were fearful of it as well.
And it also transported religion, different
Yes.
things in religion, like a night of community. And it also, news, the lock tenders homes, the lock tenders were a source of news. And a lot of boys, young boys, I don't know why girls didn't, but a lot of boys would hop the boats and go to the next lock and bring the news back to the town. And, you know, they would have a free ride, you know, just, I guess, things don't change really, human nature, you know?
You mentioned religion, and the canals did help spread religion, but it also hurt it a little bit too, because the canals basically ran 24/7. And some people thought that they should close the canals on Sunday. They wanted Sabbath laws, shut the canals down on Sundays, because then all these Irish canal workers who are drinking and swearing and fighting, they can at least have one day where they go to church and mend their ways. And others said, well, no, they're just going to stay home and drink all day long and it'll get worse. So maybe we just need to keep them working. So there were a lot of battles about whether they should shut the canals down on Sundays and
Yeah.
celebrate the Sabbath.
well, speaking of the Irish, that was one of the questions we got on here. They were asking about who built the canals. Was it primarily Irish immigrants, or do you know if any other folks helped build your canals?
I can answer it. On Erie, it was local people mostly. Then in Chenango, it was Irish people. I don't know about the other canals.
Chemung was largely Irish.
There was a great influx of Irish people up in New York City. And they just followed the canal off wherever they could find a job.
Yeah, so I know labor historian Peter Way, who wrote Common Labor, and will also be speaking here next May.
Awesome.
Sign up for the Erie Canal Museum annual pass. Don't miss it. But anyway, I know he did research that eventually, you know, later in the Erie Canal process, more and more Irish get brought on. And because, I mean, as Gary's kind of identified, the Irish gain this reputation as kind of drinkers. They're also Catholics, kind of also different in a lot of ways. Canal digging got more and more stigmatized as kind of solely a job for the Irish. So I think that by the time most of our canals are being constructed in the 1830s, 1840s, et cetera, Irish canal work had largely come to predominate.
But didn't the canals also provide work for the common working man to be able to save money and to move west? Because the west was growing, and we were, you know, we went through the gold rush time in the 1850s and again, and I mean, a lot of these people were just there temporarily to earn money because it was seasonal work anyway. That's one of the things that I read.
But they were seen as a dependent working class, that they depended on their wages to the employer, and the employer could often demand things from them, like at election time. They were told how to vote and actually stationed people at the voting booth. And in those days, you didn't vote in secret. You dropped a ballot in a box, everybody in the room watched you do it. And they could tell by the color of the ballot how you're voting. If you didn't vote the right way, you were fired the next day.
Wow.
You were out of work. So they were really dependent working class people.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the article Jessica read shows just how connected politics were to these canals. Very much were. especially as time went on. Let's see, I know we're going a bit long. If anyone needs to leave, feel free, but I don't know, do you guys feel open for more questions?
Sure.
Great. I saw we had another question of what role did your canals play during the Civil War?
So it was
Mm.
the Chenango Canal in particular, the 114th Regiment, which was mustered out of Chenango County. It's very well known within our communities that the 114th Regiment left. There's several historic markers in the locations where they stopped along the way. We have some artistic renderings of folks in front of the courthouse, of our historic courthouse, and also getting on board the packet boats as they left to fight in the Civil War. And one story in particular that ties both the Chenango County with the Erie Canal is the story of Sarah Rosetta Wakeman, who was born and raised in Afton, also in Chenango County. And she was trying to raise money for her family and disguised herself as a man and worked on the Erie Canal and was in the Rochester Buffalo area when she saw what she could earn as a soldier in the Civil War. And since she was already living as a man's life, she decided to enlist, and she is one of the best documented female soldiers of the Civil War. And unfortunately, we lost her. Private Lyons is the name that she's buried under, but she's in Louisiana. And the only reason we even know her story is in 1970, in the 1970s, someone in Afton was cleaning out their attic and found all of her letters home to her family in Afton. And so there's some really amazing stories about just her grit and her resiliency. And that, I mean, she wouldn't have been involved with the Civil War had she not been on the Erie Canal working as a canal worker. So those two vignettes in particular really resonate for us in Chenango County.
And she started on the Chenango Canal too.
Yeah.
So she was there for long. They would get bonuses for signing up, and she sent them home because they were failing. They were like dirt farmers. They were failing.
Yeah.
And she was helping out.
And for the Chemung Canal, the Civil War really breathed new life into the Chemung Canal. It was really in bad shape, and people thought it wasn't going to last much longer. But when the war breaks out, they start improving the locks again. They built a new harbor in Watkins Glen. You also have 4 barracks for training Union soldiers in Elmira, and one of them became a prison camp for Confederate soldiers. Barracks number 3 was a Confederate prison camp. So you're bringing a lot of goods in by canal that the barracks needed. Men are being brought from Rochester by steamboat down Seneca Lake and taken into Elmira. So the canal really had a lot of life breathed back into it and gave it more longevity as a result of the Civil War.
As for the Genesee, obviously a bunch of folks from the Genesee Valley will enlist in a few different Western New York regiments. One interesting regiment that we found folks from the canal boaters, canalers from the Genesee Valley Canal joined was the 54th Massachusetts, which many of you might be familiar with from the movie Glory, the first Black combat regiment in the Civil War. When you signed up for that regiment, you had to say where you were from and what your job was. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but several folks list their place of residence as Mount Morris and their job as boatmen, which presumably would mean they were working on Genesee Valley Canal. So this incredibly important unit in the Civil War has these connections to our canals. I know another member who joined the regiment, Stephen Swales. He lists his occupation as a boatman in Elmira. So probably a boatman on the Chemung Canal as well. He later became an important leader during Reconstruction in South Carolina as well. So yeah, I think a lot of different Civil War.
Reminds me, there was a boatman who was born in Watkins Glen and apparently worked there for a time, but he died at Custer's last day
Oh, interesting.
and is buried there.
Oh. There we go. A lot of veterans on the canal system. Another question we got online was the Chenango Canal flooded from time to time. I'm sure it still does. Was flooding a problem for these canals?
Yeah. Well, when they first opened up in March of 1876, it flooded some cellars. And they had animals that like eels that would puncture the sides. And I know the Erie Canal had hurry up boats where they would be repair boats and they would go out and have rope and chinks of mud and all that kind of thing to repair things. And I think they had to do the same thing. In fact, that's what we had the tow path and the other side of the canal was called the heel path. And I think that's what they used that for, to be able to have access, you know, for repairs. But yeah, flooding was a problem. So what they did was we had natural clay in a lot of the soil in our area. And they just lined the canal up and opened up again in March of 1837. And it worked and they kept replacing it. So it did have problems, but we had we had 116 locks between the Erie Canal and Binghamton. A lot of terrain, and it's up and down and up and down, and that's why the packets didn't go anywhere north of Hamilton. It was just too much hills and everything. It was too long to go. But yeah, there was flooding in the lower levels, but not our area. So in fact, the reason we got it built was because the rain that we retain in all those 7 reservoirs is 20% of whatever rains it's kept. And it was enough to feed the whole summit, the whole 5-mile summit where we are from hills above to keep water going into where locks would lose water and, you know, problems would lose water. And sometimes we had droughts, you know, but not so much a big deal with the droughts or with the flooding up where we are on the summit.
And flooding on the Chemung Canal was a major problem, and I would argue was an important contributor as to why the Chemung Canal had such a short life. As much as canal was right next to Catherine Creek or Newtown Creek or Sing Sing Creek and Big Flat. They're right next to it, and those creeks flooded every year and damaged the canal. So every year they had to fix things, and it just added to the expense of the canal. So really contributed to shortening its life.
Yeah, the Genesee Valley also had to deal with, it also, like I talked about, dealt with the problem of not having enough water, especially at summit level. It would regularly be below the kind of 4-foot level it was supposed to be because it was so hard to get water up there, but also being next to the Genesee River. That is a river that floods regularly. And like I talked about earlier, it erodes a lot of land away. In the gorge that is now Letchworth, there was one section that was especially prone to kind of washing out and landslides, which, you know, I'm sure made the canalers on that cliffside even more secure in their jobs because they had to at one point build, rather than build just into the cliffside because it kept collapsing, they had to construct a wooden trough for the canal for about a quarter of a mile or so to support it. So yeah, flooding was a big issue for them. Someone pointed out another one of the lateral canals, the Black River, had a serious problem with leaks once its citizens learned that you could put dynamite into the side of the canal. Get lucrative New York State contracts to repair it. Check out the book Forestport Breaks, available in our gift shop
Oh my goodness.
for more info on that. Which leads us into other crimes on the canal, specifically for the Chenango Canal. Someone asked about the Loomis gang. Do we know what they
I
utilize?
don't know enough about that, really.
I'll say that the Loomis gang was so ubiquitous, it wouldn't be surprising. You know, they were the mafia or the, you know, organized crime of war. So of yesteryear. So it's entirely possible. I can't imagine that there wasn't somebody. Do you know, Wade?
Yeah, the Lewis gang did have, old boats, they did transport stolen horses on Erie, and it said they did it on Chenango for the Union Army, because the Union Army was using on horses like that.
There was a boat called the Loomis on the Chenango.
Wow.
Do you think it was?
Yeah,
Golly.
from Waterville, where the Lewis gang was, it was just a couple miles over to the Chenango Canal. From there, you can go to, you can get on Erie, or you can go.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
But yeah, there was use of that.
Now, they also transported prisoners on these boats.
Oh,
Yeah,
interesting.
sometimes it was required to, you know, go from one place to another, you know, fast, and that's the fastest transport they had.
Well, looks like Looks like we're getting the hook from the audience. Any other questions? Great, well, thanks everyone for
Thank
joining. Have a good rest of your day. And thank you everyone for.
Thanks for having us.